tremendous honour to be standing here alongside the original V16 BRM, which has been within this museum for many years, and I think at the moment the engine is being restored. I did sit in the car a while ago, and I was surprised that the steering wheel was going like this, because there's nothing to attach the steering wheel to underneath, but perhaps that's something I shouldn't have mentioned. But this is the original V16 BRM, the brainchild of Raymond Mays. Its chassis number is 01, and it was the ambition of Raymond Mays to build an all-British racing car which could beat the world. Now, my book is called Raymond Mays Magnificent Obsession, and this car really represents his obsession. And it was announced, as far as I'm concerned, in 1949, and it was first presented to King George VI in 1950 at Silverstone, and I, at that time, decided I'd keep a scrapbook of the whole process and progress of the BRM from its first race onwards. The tremendous hype, because it was the British national racing car, that's how it was regarded. And over 200 British firms were involved through Raymond Mays' enormous capacity to promote things. And these 200 or more firms were all involved in producing parts. For example, Rolls-Royce produced the centrifugal supercharger, which helped to make the enormous noise that's emitted when the car is started up. One day we'll hear that again. And when we came into its first race in 1950, the Daily Express International Trophy race, there was a great build-up, and a special booklet was produced, BRM Ambassador for Britain, and everybody arrived at Silverstone with great expectations to see this wonderful British car streak ahead of all the Italian Ferraris and Alfa Romeos. Well, not for the last time. They had to work on the car overnight to get it working at all, fly it to Silverstone in time to complete 3 laps to show it was running, and then it had to sit at the back of the field, the back of the grid, with all the cars in front of it. And all eyes were on the BRM to see how it performed. I was listening on the radio, or the wireless as it was in those days, and it actually travelled 2 inches, because the drive shaft snapped as soon as it was started. And it was the original drive shaft, and they had no other, and the car had had hundreds of starts, no problem. This was the one start it was going to fail with, and one of the people would throw coins into the cockpit with derision. This car had cost so much and involved so much work and so many firms, it could only go 2 inches. Well, the career of the BRM after that was a checkered one. Later on that year, raced at Goodwood, 2 very short races, and he won both of them at the hands of Reg Parnell. And so, of course, the newspapers, because they always had the headlines, they recorded the fact that this was, BRM really was a world beater. But being a short race run in wet conditions, it wasn't really a test of the car at all. But then the following year, 1951, it arrived, or 2 cars arrived, for the British Grand Prix. All sorts of teething troubles preceded it. On one occasion, Raymond Mays drove the car against all regulations on the road from Brackley to Silverstone in time for Fangio to race it. But on this occasion, 1951, the 2 cars again arrived too late for practice. Both started at the back of the grid, and both drivers had to keep the revs down in order the car wouldn't burst. And they finished the race in 5th and 7th position, this car being the one that finished 5th. and both the drivers, Reg Parnell and Peter Walker, were slowly roasting through the race because the exhaust pipes travelled along the floor of the car and were very, very hot. And at one stage, Reg Parnell came into the pits complaining of his legs, and Tony Rudd, who was of tremendous importance in the team, soaked some cotton wool in a liquid and wrapped it around his leg and then set him off again. And he said afterwards that it didn't do Parnell any good, it made me feel a lot better. Well, then later that race, later that year, it had its last great chance was at Monza. And two cars went to Monza. Sadly, the gearbox broke on one, and it was decided to withdraw both cars from the race in case there was a crash in the race. And it was the last chance of the BRM because the powers that be decided that there was no guarantee that the Italian cars would have sufficient consistent competition for the British BRMs, so all the main Grand Prix were to be for Formula 2 cars rather than the present Formula 1. And it did provide more competition, but much less spectacle in terms of the cars. Then we move on through the ups and downs of BRM's history, making the headlines for good reason or for bad, until we come to 1953, the Grand Prix of Albi in the south of France. It was the last chance that the car would have to race on a large circuit, a road circuit, where it could really show its speed. There were 3 BRMs at that stage, and they streaked away from the field, and then one by one the treads of their tyres came away, were thrown off, because the power of the engine was such that the tyres couldn't transmit that to the roads. And so one car was totally destroyed, the driver was spared fortunately, all cars suffered damage, the other 2 cars, Fangio and Rosales, suffered damage. And the report the next day was that it was a new kind of failure, a glorious failure, because it had done so well, gone so fast, but it didn't survive the race. Well, as I said before the first race took place, I decided at the age of, I think, 13, to keep a scrapbook, to record the progress of the car, a triumphant progress I thought, to the point where it would be a world beater. Well, I kept it and I faithfully recorded the failures as well as the successes. When it got to 1952, I sent the book to Raymond Mays, who lived in Bourne in Lincolnshire, and I said, would you please write a foreword for my book? Well, I had a book about British cars 1950-51, which had a foreword by Raymond Mays. So I decided, yes, every worthwhile book must have a foreword, if possible, by Raymond Mays. Well, Raymond Mays kindly wrote this foreword, and the foreword is the foreword on my book. And in that foreword, he described really his purpose. And he said he was the originator of the ERA before the war, the English Racing Automobile, which was an English team which represented the country on the continent of Europe and did very well, won many races. And then after the war, he decided to build this national racing car, the British Racing Motor, and hence the course of the car and the course of my scrapbook. Well, when we got to 1954, or 53, because of the mixed fortunes of BRM, the whole firm was taken over by Rubery Owen, and in particular Sir Alfred Owen, as he became. And it was time for me to begin my second scrapbook, because the first book was full. I didn't like to risk the new book to the post, So I simply wrote to Alfred Owen, could you please write a foreword for the second edition of my book? Raymond Mays had said that before he sent my first one back, he showed it to all his directors, so perhaps he remembered that. But Alfred Owen wrote a very carefully considered piece about the BRM for my second scrapbook, saying that he would continue to race this car for as long as it was possible, as long as there were races for it, but he was going to develop a new car for the new formula. For good measure, I thought I'd write to David Brown, now later Sir David Brown, the head of Aston Martin and of Gonda, and would he write a piece for the book. And I sent with my letter a small painting about this size of an Aston Martin DB3S. And he wrote back saying he'd had my painting framed and put in his office, and he wrote the piece for the book. Well, that was really describes the book and the car, and its fairly brief history really, in the limelight for good reasons or for bad. But that little painting, which I sent to David Brown, it led to many more paintings, because it was in the 1980s. My wife said I ought to have a hobby. I was spending far too long visiting the sick and the elderly in the parish before we were elderly, and she bought me some paints, and for 12 months I didn't touch them. So 12 months later she bought me a canvas board. So I had to do something about this, so I started to paint. And I sold 2 or 3 paintings, because the owner of a gallery said to me, you paint some pictures, I'll sell them. And I thought it seemed to be very boring to paint merely to sell. And I began to think, now, how long has that painting taken me? Was it really worth all that time? And I thought, if they're good enough to sell, they're good enough to give away. So I gave one painting to Enzo Ferrari, and a nice letter back from him, and I sent another one to Sterling Moss, and to Jack Brabham, and so on, until I'd painted over 200 paintings to everyone who was anybody in the world of motor racing. But of course that involved quite a number of people who were crucially involved with the BRM, not just the V16 BRM, but the 4-cylinder that followed it, and the V8 cylinder, and the V8, right way through to the V12 in the end. BRM continued in 1972, and so well, not only did I have letters from these people, but in many cases got to know them very well. So it was a very enriching holiday, it was a very enriching hobby. And but the letters I had, because I'd always ask them some fairly pointed question, wanting an answer from it, all those letters, or the relevant letters, are all in my book as well, and they help to fill out the story. So I like to say that that Raymond Mays Magnificent Obsession is really a story told by those who are most closely related to it. Some of them didn't pull their punches. Sterling Moss had a bad experience. The only time he drove the car in a race was in Ulster, just a week after the Albi experience, and so the car wasn't really ready. And its clutch was gone before it started, it overheated in the first lap, and the steering column came off in his hand. So he wrote to me that the BRM, the V16 BRM, was the best sounding, worst car I've ever driven. Well, my loyalty to this car was such that I needed some justification. And could he explain? And I even went as far as to say, if instead of BRM running this car, Alfa Romeo had been in charge, or Ferrari, would have gone better. He wrote back, no, he said there's a fatal flaw in the design, and its power only comes in at over 6,000 revs per minute. Then it comes in with such a rush that it's barely manageable. In fact, only one driver mastered the BRM, and that was Fangio. When he first was offered the chance to drive it, he jumped in, drove off at high speed, never having touched it before, came back minutes later with a bent exhaust pipe. They straightened the exhaust pipe, he jumped in again and went in a flash and never looked backwards. Mastered the car in minutes. He was the master, really, amongst all racing drivers. Well, one or two, literally one or two anecdotes which might be worth saying. Raymond Mays was a tremendously talented racing driver in the 1930s, as well as someone who developed very fast cars. In 1935 he went to Germany to compete in the Eifel Rennen in his ERA. There were 4 ERAs in the race and he was a team leader, Wert's team leader. And the Eifel Rennen is 40 miles in length and drivers take a long time to get to know it. So he spent the whole of the night before the race driving around the circuit in his 3.5 litre Bentley saloon with the headlamps and the fog lights on to show the way, and then he won the race. And of course the race he had to keep pumping the fuel pump to keep the pressure up in between corners, and he won. Well, this was Hitler's Germany, and it was forbidden to take any money out of the country. So Raymond Mays and the other ERA drivers rolled their banknotes into a ball and pushed them up the exhaust pipes of their cars, and so they successfully smuggled them out of Germany. Rather a nice touch. I sent letters to 2 ERA drivers, Ian Connell and Bob Gerard. And I have been interesting letters back which are in the book. And Ian Connell told me that 50 years after the 1938 Donington Grand Prix, he was invited with Wilkie Wilkinson to a celebration. They're the only 2 drivers were still living. And they brought the actual ERA that Ian Connell had driven to the circuit to be photographed with Ian Connell. And Ian Connell had a painting I'd sent him of his ERA during the race being overtaken by an auto union, and he said he put this on the bonnet of the car. So I thought it was a tremendous thing to hear. He had done that. And in 1959 the BRM was not this model but the later 4-cylinder model, was at Monza for the Italian Grand Prix and being more competitive but without winning. And Raymond Mays was there standing in front of the pits with all the other mechanics and staff and so on. And 6 very burly Italian policemen came up, didn't recognise who he was, decided he was in a prohibited area, so forcibly tried to drag him away. Well, at this was the time when the Stanleys, Jean Stanley, who was Alfred Owen's sister, Louis Stanley, her husband, were very much involved. Jean Stanley showed remarkable ingenuity and snatched the helmet off one of the policemen and ran off with it. And by the time they found this policeman's helmet abandoned, Jean was nowhere to be seen. And I think the last thing I'd like to say, I'm only touching on this great subject. Last thing I'd say that Kath and I visited Raymond Mays on a couple of occasions. We corresponded all the way through the years, and his letters reflect the changing fortunes of the car, which they're quite important in that respect. And we went to see Louis and Jean Stanley in their house in Trumpington in Cambridge, and they showed us a huge photograph album filled with photographs of all the different personalities of motor racing, mostly in the pits of races, others in Buckingham Palace. Louis Stanley was thought to be an English count by everybody on the continent. He never said anything to dispute that. But when we walked into the living room, my painting of Jackie Stewart in the BRM in 1965 at Spa was on his mantelpiece. They took us upstairs to where the trophies were, and my painting of Graham Hill in the Monaco Grand Prix was leaning up against a massive cup that was won by BRM in that race. Something else flashed through my mind, but I think it's gone forever. Anyway, it's I'm glad to have this opportunity. It seems to be a wonderful occasion to launch the book and to wish it well. Thank you all for coming along. I hope you'll stop for a cup of tea before you leave, see the other exhibits. I'd like to thank again Russell Bowman and Doug Hill for allowing this to happen. And Kim Phillips, who designed the book, here we are, she should have her name on the cover. Because she sent me chapter by chapter in the post. My previous publisher would say to me, here are the proofs, I want them back in 2 days. And that was it. You just went through to find typing errors, and that was it. But no, Kim would send me chapter by chapter, and I would be able to say, well now, I think this picture should be larger, or this one's smaller, or take that one out. And she had some ideas herself. And so the book was very much her creation in that respect. And Kevin, who unfortunately, well, I say unfortunately couldn't be here, he's on holiday, but Kevin Atkins, he prepared the paintings for publication. Paul Castle was here from Veloce, so big thank you to both of you for coming, and thank you to you all.